a warship so feared that entire fleets abandoned their posts at the mere sight of it. Not because of its size, nor because of its devastating firepower, but because of what it represented. Across the galaxy, its name was spoken in hushed whispers, a ghost story that haunted the nightmares of those who had survived an encounter with it. The ultimate predator in the void, the harbinger of ruin, the reason entire species reconsidered their ambitions of war. At first, it had been dismissed as myth, an exaggerated tale spread by terrified survivors who had lost their fleets to a force they couldn't comprehend. But myths don't leave wreckage. Myths don't carve their names into the annals of history with fire and blood. Myths don't raise a flag and dare the universe to challenge them. And yet, when the truth was finally laid bare, when those who scoffed at the legends saw the warship with their own eyes, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no myth. This was the horizon. Humanity had always been an anomaly in the eyes of the galactic community. A latecomer to the stars, a civilization that had clawed its way out of its gravity well through sheer determination, brute force, and an almost pathological refusal to surrender. Other species had evolved in harmony with their worlds, mastering their environments, building great societies before ever reaching for the cosmos. Humans? They had fought their way up the food chain, warring with nature itself for every scrap of survival. And when they finally reached the stars, they brought with them the one lesson the universe had long forgotten. War was not just strategy. War was survival. At first, the greater civilizations saw humans as nothing more than another upstart species, destined to be absorbed, conquered, or crushed beneath the weight of empires that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. They had seen it happened before. Species that burned brightly but faded just as fast, unable to withstand the relentless forces of galactic warfare. Humanity, they believed, would be no different. Then came the first encounter. An unknown warship, unlike anything ever recorded, was spotted at the edge of known space. It drifted silently, its hull battle-scarred, its weapons offline. A prize, the aliens thought. A derelict vessel, perhaps the remains of some failed experiment. They moved in with cautious curiosity, scanning it, trying to understand the technology behind it. That was when they realized the ship was not abandoned, it was watching. Moments before the alien boarding parties could land, the warship activated. Engines flared to life, energy signatures surged across its surface, and within seconds, the hunters became the hunted. The unknown vessel moved like a phantom, impossibly fast for something of its size. Targeting systems locked onto the alien warships, and in a single coordinated attack, it fired. The devastation was unlike anything ever seen, not just in its raw destructive power, but in the precision of the assault. The enemy ships weren't simply destroyed, they were dismantled. Targeted fire ripped through key structural points. Engines were surgically severed, weapons depowered in an instant. It was not a battle, it was a message. That message was clear. You are not the predators here, you are the prey. And yet, what truly sent a chill through the surviving alien commanders was not the weapons, not the tactics, not even the impossible way the warship had emerged from nowhere. It was what they saw emblazoned across its hull when the smoke cleared, when the wreckage of their fleets drifted silently into the abyss. A flag, crimson, white, and blue, bold against the dark metal, waving defiantly as if mocking the very idea that humans could be defeated. They had expected an enemy like any other. They had prepared for a war of numbers, of strategies, of overwhelming force. What they had not prepared for was humanity's unyielding defiance. This was not just a ship. It was a declaration. The name of the vessel soon spread like wildfire, whispered in the halls of power, feared in the deepest corners of the galaxy. Some called it the doom of empires, others the ghost in the void. But among the humans, it had only one name: Horizon, the last thing an enemy ever saw before being swallowed by the abyss. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. For all its terrifying reputation, no one truly understood what made Horizons so deadly. Until the first full-scale battle. That was when the galaxy learned the most horrifying truth of all. They weren't just fighting a warship. They were fighting a force of nature. The destruction of the First Fleet was not merely a warning. It was an omen. An omen of something far worse than the galactic powers had ever imagined. The horizon had revealed itself, and in doing so, it shattered the illusion of safety that the old empires had wrapped themselves in for millennia. These were civilizations that had spent thousands of years perfecting their methods of war, refining strategies, developing technologies, and securing their dominance over the cosmos. They had faced countless uprisings, crushed rebellions, and annihilated rival species before they could ever pose a true threat. But humanity was something different. It wasn't just another aggressive race clawing at the fringes of the galaxy, hoping for a chance at survival. No, humans were something far more terrifying. They weren't here to challenge the order of things. They were here to rewrite it. First, the great empires refused to believe what had happened. One battle, no matter how devastating, did not make a species unstoppable. The fleet that had been destroyed must have been unprepared, outmaneuvered, or technologically inferior. There had to be a weakness, a flaw to exploit. No warship, no matter how powerful, could stand against the full might of an empire. And so, a coalition was formed. 5 of the most dominant species in the galaxy, each one with battle fleets numbering in the tens of thousands, set aside their differences for a singular purpose: to hunt down the horizon, to erase the very idea of its existence, to crush humanity before it became something truly uncontrollable. They deployed their armadas, tracking down every lead, scanning every system where the horizon had been sighted. And then, after months of relentless pursuit, they finally found it. Drifting once more, alone, unguarded, a single warship against an armada that could have conquered entire star systems in mere days. But this time, they would not make the same mistake. They would not move in blindly. They would not assume anything about this vessel's capabilities. Every tactic, every strategy, every contingency was considered. They surrounded the horizon from all sides, cutting off every possible escape route. They bombarded it with EMP bursts, trying to disable its systems. They launched drone swarms by the millions, designed to overwhelm even the most advanced AI defenses. They prepared to deploy boarding parties the moment its shields failed, and for a moment, it seemed to work. The warship remained motionless, its systems flickering under the onslaught. Power fluctuations rippled across its hull, and for the briefest second, some of the alien commanders believed they had won. The ship had finally met its match. The legend was just that, a legend. A terrifying story spun out of exaggeration and fear. Then, the ship spoke. Across every communication channel, across every ship in the fleet, a single transmission cut through the noise like a blade through flesh. It was not a threat, not a warning. It was something far worse. Is that all? The voice was human. Cold. Calculated. Amused. Before the fleet could react, the horizon moved. It was not an escape. It was not a retreat. It was a calculated, merciless slaughter. The warship accelerated with impossible speed, weaving through the armada, with a level of precision that defied all logic. It did not fire blindly. It did not waste a single shot. Every weapon discharge was deliberate. Every strike designed not just to destroy, but to disable, to cripple, to humiliate. Flagships, the pride of entire civilizations, were torn apart in seconds. Fighters and bombers were reduced to nothing, more than drifting wreckage. The horizon's shields flared as enemy fire rained down upon it. But it did not slow, did not falter. It danced between the burning remains of warships like a predator weaving through its dying prey. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The once mighty armada, the coalition's greatest show of force, had been reduced to nothing more than twisted metal and drifting corpses. The survivors, if they could even be called that, were left paralyzed in shock. And that was when they saw it. The flag. Projected, across the remains of their fallen fleet, floating in the void as if to mock the very idea that anyone could stand against it. That symbol, that defiant banner, burned itself into the memories of every species that had dared to challenge humanity. It was no longer just a warning. It was a promise. The Horizon was not a warship. It was a force of nature. And humanity? Humanity was not just another species. They were the storm that would reshape the galaxy. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. The aftermath of the battle sent shockwaves through the galaxy. News of the destruction of the Coalition fleet spread like wildfire, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape the carnage. Entire empires, once confident in their supremacy, now found themselves paralyzed with fear. The Horizon was no longer just a warship. It had become something far greater. A symbol, a specter, a force that defied all known military doctrine. For the first time in history, the ruling powers of the galaxy found themselves asking a terrifying question. What if humanity was unstoppable? Attempts to understand the Horizon's capabilities only deepened the mystery. The vessel's energy signatures were unlike anything recorded in known space. Its speed, its firepower, its defenses, every aspect of its design defied conventional engineering. Some theorized that humanity had uncovered lost precursor technology, artifacts from an ancient, godlike civilization that had long since vanished. Others believed that the warship was not a product of human ingenuity at all, but something far worse. Something humanity had created through sheer, ruthless willpower. Whatever the truth was, one fact remained indisputable. The Horizon had rewritten the laws of warfare. Panic spread through the galactic elite. Secret councils were formed. Emergency summits held in the darkest corners of the universe, where the most powerful rulers and military strategists gathered in whispered desperation. These were beings who had never known fear, species that had crushed countless civilizations beneath their boots without a second thought. And yet now, they spoke in hushed tones, afraid that even uttering the name of the Horizon too loudly might summon it from the darkness. Paranoia took hold. Entire fleets were reassigned. Border worlds were abandoned. Some empires resorted to extreme measures, detonating planets that were even suspected of harboring human activity. They did not seek war, they sought survival. But humanity? Humanity did not attack, did not retaliate, did not demand surrender. They did something far worse. They waited. And that was when the true horror began. The silence. For months, no one saw the Horizon. No one heard from humanity. No warships, no transmissions, no movement from their claimed territories. It was as if they had simply disappeared into the void. And yet, their presence was felt everywhere. Every empire that had once considered itself untouchable now watched the darkness with dread, waiting for the inevitable. It was a fear more paralyzing than any invasion, more crippling than any direct assault, because the galaxy now knew the truth. It wasn't a matter of if the Horizon would return. It was a matter of when. The psychological toll was devastating. Civil unrest broke out on countless worlds as populations demanded answers. How could their mighty rulers, their great and powerful empires, stand helpless against a single warship? How could their fleets, the pride of entire civilizations, be rendered worthless in the face of a single human vessel? And then, just as that fear reached its peak, the Horizon revealed itself once more. Not through an attack, not through a show of force, but through something far worse. A message, broadcasted across every galactic communication network, overriding even the most secure channels. A single transmission cut through the vastness of space. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't coded in some unbreakable human cipher. It was spoken plainly, in a voice that carried neither malice nor rage, a simple declaration. We were never your enemy, but you made us one. For the ruling powers, it was the worst possible outcome, because it meant that humanity was not fighting out of hatred, not out of conquest, not out of the hunger for domination that had driven so many other species to war. They were fighting because they had no other choice, and that made them unstoppable. The Horizon was no longer a warship to be feared. It was a herald of what was coming, a warning of what humanity had become. And now, The galaxy had a choice: surrender or burn. The Horizon's message echoed across the cosmos, reverberating in the hearts of rulers, warriors, and civilians alike. The meaning was clear. Humanity had no intention of bowing, no desire for conquest, and no patience for further hostility. Yet, beneath those simple words, there was an unspoken threat, a warning carved in the remains of shattered fleets and broken empires. The galaxy had never faced anything like this before. Wars had been waged over resources, dominance, pride, and survival. Empires had risen and fallen, battles fought with strategic cunning and overwhelming firepower. But never had an enemy declared war not with a demand for territory, not with a hunger for destruction, but with silence. That silence was worse than any planetary bombardment, worse than the annihilation of entire fleets, because it meant humanity was not bound by the rules that governed galactic warfare. They were not a conqueror demanding tribute, nor a tyrant, claiming dominion over the stars. They were something infinitely more dangerous, an unknown, and unknowns terrified the galaxy more than any superweapon ever could. In response, desperate measures were taken. The most powerful empires convened, in an emergency summit, gathering their finest strategists, scientists, and military minds. Across the vastness of space, encrypted communications flickered between sovereign systems, secret diplomatic channels buzzing with frantic discussions. The question on everyone's mind was the same: what do we do now? Some advocated for full-scale war, believing that overwhelming force, an alliance of all great militaries, was the only way to eliminate the human threat before it grew even more uncontrollable. Plans were drawn up for massive preemptive strikes, fleet movements calculated with precision. Millions of warships stood at the ready, their weapon systems primed to wipe out humanity before it was too late. But others weren't so sure. Humanity had already proven their capability in battle. A coalition of the galaxy's strongest navies had fallen before a single warship. What if the Horizon wasn't unique? What if there were more vessels like it, hidden in the darkness, waiting to strike? What if, against all calculations, the humans had already won this war without firing another shot? Paranoia took hold. Intelligence agencies scoured the void for any sign of additional human fleet movements, searching for evidence of an armada lying in wait. But nothing was found. No hidden forces, no secret battle groups. Just the Horizon, alone, standing against the entire galaxy with nothing but its reputation as a shield. Yet, that was enough. Because by now, the psychological war had been lost. Entire civilizations trembled at the thought of retaliation. Military leaders, once eager for war, found themselves hesitating before issuing orders. Even the most hardened admirals, commanders, who had led fleets into battle for centuries, couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in their minds. What if humanity knew something we didn't? It was a seed of fear that grew like wildfire. And then, just when tensions reached their breaking point, humanity did something no one expected. They didn't attack. They didn't demand reparations. They sent an envoy. The moment the signal was received, panic erupted among the ruling factions. It was the first time humanity had reached out directly since the battle, a transmission offering nothing but a simple request: a meeting. Not in the war rooms of galactic leaders, not in the towering halls of empire capitals. No security fleets, no grand demonstrations of power. Just a simple neutral location in the void, an abandoned trade station, floating in the blackness between worlds, far from any system of strategic value. The implications were terrifying. The first time, the galaxy's greatest powers were faced with an unsettling realization. Humanity was not behaving like a war-hungry species. They weren't seeking vengeance, weren't pushing for total domination. They wanted diplomacy, but that only made them more dangerous. Because any empire, any species, any civilization that could win a war and still choose diplomacy was a force beyond reckoning. And so, with unease gripping their hearts, the galactic rulers accepted the invitation. Delegates were chosen. Ambassadors, strategists, advisors, all sent with one mission: to learn what humanity truly wanted, and above all, to understand why they hadn't already conquered the stars. The meeting was set. The galaxy held its breath. and aboard the cold, silent trade station, beneath the flickering glow of ancient lights, humanity's chosen representative arrived. Not a warrior, not a conqueror, just a single officer, clad in the uniform of their fleet, standing alone beneath the fluttering banner of their people. A simple, unassuming flag, stitched in red, white, and blue, gently waving in the artificial breeze. And at that moment, the galaxy realized the truth. They had not feared the warship. They had feared the people behind it. The silence within the trade station was suffocating. The delegation of alien dignitaries, representatives of empires that had once ruled vast star clusters without opposition, stood frozen, staring at the human officer before them. Their eyes, many pairs of them, flickered between the figure and the simple flag that hung behind them. It was almost absurd. They had expected a towering warrior clad in fearsome battle armor, a hardened general who carried the weight of countless victories. They had anticipated an ultimatum, a demand for surrender, or worse, the terms of their subjugation. But instead, there was just a human. No soldiers, no bodyguards, no imposing fleet hovering overhead, bristling with weapons. Just one person, and a flag. That flag. It disturbed them more than any warship ever could. Because they had seen it before, fluttering in the wreckage of their fleets, marking the battlefield like an unspoken declaration. It had stood tall when their greatest weapons had failed, when their most brilliant commanders had been outmaneuvered. It wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol, a silent reminder of something they could not understand, but had every reason to fear. The human officer stepped forward, their boots echoing against the steel floor. Their posture was relaxed, yet there was something deliberate in their movements, an unshakable confidence, the kind that came not from arrogance, but from the certainty of survival. They were not here to intimidate, yet their very presence was enough to send shivers through the gathered delegates. They spoke. Their voice was calm, measured. There was no hostility, no anger. Just a simple question, delivered with quiet finality. Do you understand now? A weighted pause. The delegates exchanged glances, their minds racing with conflicting emotions. Some of them wanted to deny it, to argue, to resist, to cling to the belief that humanity's victory had been a fluke, that they had somehow cheated fate, but deep down they knew. They had known since the moment their warships had turned to dust against the horizon's guns. Yes, they understood. And yet, one of them, an admiral from a warlike species known for its ruthless campaigns, steeled themselves and stepped forward. Their voice, though laced with uncertainty, carried the weight of a question that had haunted the galaxy since the battle. Why? The human officer tilted their head slightly. Why what? Why haven't you taken everything? Why haven't you crushed us? We know you could. We saw what your ship could do. We know your kind is more than capable of ruling over us. So why? The admiral's voice faltered, the words difficult to speak. Why didn't you? The human's expression remained unreadable for a long moment. Then, with an almost amused sigh, they leaned forward slightly. Because we're not like you. The words hit harder than any weapon. The delegation recoiled as if struck, their minds struggling to process the sheer weight of that statement. It wasn't spoken as an insult. It wasn't meant to demean them. It was simply a fact. One of the diplomats, a scholar from a civilization that prided itself on logic and reason, narrowed their eyes. What do you mean? The human exhaled, as if considering how best to explain something so fundamental to their species. Then, they gestured toward the flag behind them. Do you know what this means to us? Silence. Of course, they had studied human culture extensively since first contact. They had dissected their history, analyzed their wars, their triumphs, their failures. They knew what flags were, symbols of nations, banners carried into battle, emblems of identity. But this felt different. The human officer continued. You see, every civilization we've encountered so far, you all fight for one reason: power, survival, dominance. And every time you assume we must think the same way. That our flag is just another banner in an endless struggle for control over the stars. They shook their head. But to us, it's more than that. It's not about war. It's not about conquest. It's about what it represents, the people behind it, our families, our friends, our homes. It's about who we are. The officer's voice grew softer, yet somehow carried more weight. That's why we don't conquer. That's why we don't demand submission. We don't fight for domination. We fight so that no one can dominate us. We fight so that our flag never falls, so that the people behind it never have to live in fear. A beat of silence passed. And that's why we didn't take everything after the battle. Because we don't want your worlds, your resources, or your subjugation. We don't need them. We only wanted you to understand that if you ever force us to fight, we will. And when we do, we don't stop until the fight is over. The room was deathly still. For the first time, the delegates saw the truth. The horizon wasn't the reason humanity was feared. Their technology wasn't the reason they had won. It was them. A species that did not seek war, yet refused to back down. A species that fought not for conquest, but for the right to exist without fear. A species that, when provoked, did not simply retaliate, but ended the conflict so that it would never happen again. It was terrifying. It was humbling. And in a way, it was hopeful. Because for the first time, the galaxy saw an alternative to the endless cycle of war. An empire that did not conquer. A power that did not demand submission. A force that could change the balance of the stars. Not through destruction, but through conviction. The delegates realized something that day. Humanity was not a threat because of their weapons. They were a threat because of their resolve. And that was something no warship, no fleet, no empire could ever break. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as the gathered alien dignitaries processed the words that had just been spoken. It was not the answer they had expected. It was not the answer they wanted. But it was the only answer that made sense. The human officer had not raised their voice. There had been no threats, no veiled warnings of future retaliation. And yet, those words carried more weight than any ultimatum. Some of the delegates still struggled with the concept. It was in their nature to view power in terms of conquest, to measure strength by the number of worlds controlled, fleets commanded, and species subjugated. And yet, here stood a species whose power did not come from domination, but from a refusal to be dominated. It was a concept so alien to them that it bordered on heresy. One of the delegates, a veteran of centuries of warfare, finally spoke, their voice hesitant, uncertain. "You mean to say that you fight only when you must? That you do not seek to expand, to take what is weaker than you?" There was no disbelief in their tone, only the quiet horror of one who had glimpsed something beyond their understanding. The human officer nodded once, their expression unchanging. "We have no desire to rule," they said simply, "but we also refuse to be ruled. We do not fight for the sake of conquest, nor for the thrill of battle. We fight so that no one can ever dictate our future for us. We fight so that our children, our people, can live without the shadow of war hanging over them. And if that means we must become something terrifying in the eyes of the galaxy, then so be it." Another delegate, one who had been among those who had plotted the war against humanity, found their voice. Their skin shifted through shades of unease, a subconscious display of their inner turmoil. "But you could have ended us. After the battle, after we lost everything, you could have struck the final blow. Why did you spare us?" The human regarded them for a long moment before answering. "Because what would that have achieved? Would it have undone the war? Would it have brought back the lives lost on both sides? No. It would have only created more fear, more enemies, more reasons for the cycle to continue. And we have no interest in that cycle." The admiral who had spoken earlier looked at the human with something approaching awe. "You are the only species that has ever spoken this way. Every civilization before you that reached this level of power used it to claim everything in sight. Even we would have taken what we could, secured our position, and crushed any resistance before it could form." The human officer exhaled softly, a tired, almost knowing smile crossing their face. "And that is why history repeats itself for so many. But we are not here to rewrite the past. We are here to ensure the future is different." The flag behind them seemed to take on a new weight in the eyes of those gathered. It was no longer just a banner, no longer a symbol of mere victory. It was something deeper, something that resonated in a way that none of them could quite put into words. For all their centuries of war, for all their strategies and military doctrines, for all their understanding of power, they had never encountered something like this. A people who did not seek control, but instead sought only to defend what was theirs, no matter the cost. And worse, a people who had no illusions about war, who understood its horrors better than anyone, and yet were willing to fight with such ferocity that even the most hardened conquerors in the galaxy had recoiled. The silence stretched on, the weight of unspoken understanding settling over them all. There would be no more war, not because of treaties, not because of concessions, but because they all knew, deep down, that challenging humanity again would not just be foolish, it would be suicidal. There was no room for arrogance now, no delusions that their fleets could overwhelm the next time. The lesson had been learned, the war had been fought, and humanity had emerged, not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as something far more dangerous. A species that had nothing to prove to the stars, a species that did not seek to expand, yet could never be forced into submission. A species that had shown, without a shadow of a doubt, why the deadliest warship in the galaxy did not need to fire another shot. Because the moment the human flag was seen, the battle was already over. The gathered alien leaders, hardened by centuries of war and conquest, could not comprehend the reality before them. They had spent their lives believing that strength was measured in the ability to dominate, that power was defined by how many civilizations could be bent to one's will. But humanity did not play by those rules. They did not conquer. They did not seek to rule. And yet they were feared more than any empire, more than any warlord, more than any force the galaxy had ever known. Because they had proven something that no other species had dared to accept. The greatest power was not in controlling others, it was in ensuring that no one could ever control you. The weight of that realization settled upon them all. The war had been lost, not because humanity had outnumbered them, not because they had superior firepower, though their weapons were unmatched, but because the very foundation upon which the war had been conceived had crumbled the moment they understood what humanity truly was. They had thought Earth's fleets were like any other, that given the right tactics, the right numbers, the right strategies, they could be broken. But they had failed to grasp the simple truth that had become evident in every battle, in every engagement, in every desperate, futile attempt to shatter the will of humankind. Humans did not fight for conquest. They did not fight for wealth or territory. They fought because they refused to kneel, and that made them unstoppable. One of the alien warlords, a veteran of 1,000 battles, turned his gaze to the human officer standing before him. There was no smugness in the human's expression, no arrogance, no gloating over their victory. That, more than anything, sent a chill through the warlord's soul. They had expected wrath. They had expected the cold, merciless vengeance of a species that had been attacked without provocation. Instead, they were met with a quiet, steady resolve that was infinitely more terrifying. The warlord spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could have destroyed us. You could have razed our homeworlds, wiped out our fleets, reduced our legacy to dust. Why didn't you?" The human officer studied him for a moment before responding. "Because that is not our way. We do not destroy, unless we must, but do not mistake that for mercy. The war ended because you understood that if we wanted to, we could have erased you. Not because we wished to, but because we would have had no choice." The warlord shuddered. He had always believed that mercy was a weakness, that to show restraint was to invite defeat. But in this moment, staring at the very species that had broken his people without breaking them entirely, he understood how wrong he had been. This was not weakness. This was a strength so absolute, so unshakable that it required no show of force. And then his eyes flickered to the flag. The human flag stood behind the officer, its colors unyielding, its presence a silent statement that needed no further explanation. It was not the flag of an empire, not the banner of a species that sought dominion. It was a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of an unbreakable spirit that no armada could extinguish. He realized now why the war had truly been lost. It was not just because of human ships, human weapons, or human strategies. It was because of what that flag represented. Other species fought to take. Humanity fought so that no one could take from them. Another alien delegate, one who had been among the war's architects, spoke hesitantly. And if another war comes? If another empire rises and decides to test your strength again? The human officer's gaze was steady, unwavering. Then they will learn the same lesson you did. We do not seek war, but we will never run from it. We do not conquer, but we will never be conquered. And if anyone forces our hand again, they will regret it. The silence that followed was suffocating. For so long, the galaxy had believed that the most dangerous force was the one that sought total control. But now they saw the truth. The most dangerous force was the one that sought nothing at all, except the right to exist on its own terms. A force that had no interest in ruling, no ambition for dominion, but one that could never be ruled. That was what made humanity terrifying. That was what made them invincible. And that was why, from this day forward, the moment a human flag was seen, every fleet, every army, every would-be conqueror in the galaxy would hesitate. Because they knew what would come next. The gathered alien leaders sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing upon them like the crushing gravity of a dying star. Everything they had known, everything they had believed about war, conquest, and power had been shattered by a single undeniable truth. Humanity was beyond their reach, not because of superior numbers, not even because of their unmatched technology, but because their strength was built upon something no empire, no warlord, no tyrant could ever comprehend. War had not been lost in a single battle. It had not been lost when their warships burned, when their fleets were scattered, when entire planetary defenses crumbled under the relentless precision of human strategy. It had been lost the moment they saw what humans were willing to fight for. The moment they understood that this was not a war of territory, not a conflict over resources, not even an ideological crusade. Humanity did not fight for glory or dominion. They fought for something far greater. Freedom. It was a word many of the alien leaders had never truly considered. Freedom was a concept reserved for those who ruled, for those who held the chains, not those who resisted them. And yet, here stood the one species in the galaxy that had never been enslaved, never been broken, never been subjugated. They had not achieved that through sheer firepower, nor through diplomacy alone. They had achieved it because they had willed it into existence, because they had built their entire civilization upon the promise that no force, no empire, no god would ever dictate their fate. The warlord who had once believed himself invincible found himself looking at the human officer with something he had never thought he would feel toward an enemy. Not hatred, not anger, but something far worse. Respect, fear, and something deeper, something almost like envy. With a deep breath, the warlord forced himself to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. And what of us now? What becomes of those who once sought to conquer you? The human officer regarded him for a long moment before answering. That is up to you. We did not start this war. We did not come seeking vengeance. We never wanted to fight you. But we did. And we won. What you do next will determine what happens now. The warlord felt a chill crawl through his spine. The human was offering them a choice. No demands, no ultimatums, just a choice, a path forward. But there was no mistaking the unspoken warning beneath the words. If they chose war again, humanity would not hesitate to end it. A murmur passed through the assembled alien delegates. Some bristled at the idea of surrender, their pride unwilling to accept defeat. But others understood the deeper reality. The war had already been lost the moment they saw the flag. That was the moment they realized humanity could not be conquered. That was the moment they understood that no force in the galaxy could break a people who refused to be ruled. One by one, the warlords, the admirals, the leaders who had once believed themselves destined to carve out an empire, bowed their heads in reluctant understanding. The war was over, and in its place, something else began. A truth that would ripple across the galaxy for generations to come. From this day forward, no fleet, no empire, no warlord would ever look upon Earth the same way again. From this day forward, the sight of a human warship would send shivers through the bones of every would-be conqueror. From this day forward, whenever an invading force gazed upon the human flag, they would know the truth. This was not a species that could be defeated. This was not a species that could be ruled. This was a species that had earned the right to stand among the stars, not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most advanced, but because they were the only ones who truly understood what it meant to fight. Not for conquest, not for power, but for the one thing worth more than all the worlds in the universe: freedom. And so, as the last warship of the alien armada turned away from Earth's skies, as the battered remnants of their once mighty fleets retreated into the black void of space, one final message was transmitted across the galaxy. A message that would be whispered in hushed tones, recorded in ancient histories, feared by all who sought to subjugate others. The humans do not seek war. But if war finds them, pray you never see their flag.